The notary waited until the room was completely silent before opening the envelope. Jeanne sat upright, already expecting something difficult. Her twin brother Simon leaned back with folded arms, as though he had decided in advance that nothing written by their mother could surprise him anymore. Their mother, Nawal Marwan, had died after months of silence. She had not explained what had happened to her. She had not said why, after an ordinary visit to a public swimming pool, she had suddenly stopped speaking. She had simply withdrawn from the world, carrying one last secret with her. Now the secret seemed to be waiting inside the envelope. Nawal's instructions were unlike any final request her children had ever heard. She did not want a coffin. She did not want prayers. She wanted to be buried naked, with her face turned toward the earth, away from the sky and away from the world. There was to be no stone, no name, and no inscription above her grave. A person who breaks a promise, she had written, does not deserve an epitaph. A person who remains silent when the truth must be spoken does not deserve to look the world in the face. Simon reacted with anger. To him, this was one final act of cruelty from a mother who had always seemed distant, severe, and impossible to understand. Even in death, she was forcing her children to live inside her silence. But the notary had not finished. Nawal had left 2 sealed letters. Jeanne was ordered to find their father and place the first letter in his hands. Simon was ordered to find their brother and deliver the second. The problem was simple and impossible at the same time. Jeanne and Simon had always believed their father was dead. They had never been told that they had a brother. Only after both letters had been delivered, Nawal wrote, could a stone be placed on her grave. Only then could her name be carved into it. Only then would the silence be broken. The twins left the office with 2 questions that seemed to belong to 2 different families. Who was the father their mother insisted was alive? And who was the brother she had hidden from them for their entire lives? Simon wanted nothing to do with either question. He believed their mother had been unwell and that the will was the last expression of her confusion. Jeanne could not dismiss it so easily. Their mother had been many things, but she had never been careless. Every word in the document had been chosen with frightening precision. Jeanne was also haunted by the final months of Nawal's life. Before the silence, there had been the swimming pool. Nawal had been sitting near the water when she noticed a man walking along the edge. At first, she did not look at his face. Her attention fell lower, toward his bare foot. There, on his heel, she saw 3 small marks arranged close together. Then the man turned. Something inside Nawal collapsed. She stared at him as if she were looking at 2 different people at once. Her breathing changed. Her body became rigid. From that day forward, words seemed to disappear from her. No one understood what she had seen. After Nawal's death, Jeanne began searching through old papers. She found records from a university in the country where her mother had been born, a country that had once been torn apart by civil war. She found the name of a professor. She found traces of a village. None of it explained the 2 letters, but every clue pointed back to a past Nawal had refused to describe. Jeanne traveled there alone. She arrived expecting to recover a family history. Instead, she entered a landscape built from ruins, old loyalties, and memories that people still feared to speak aloud. The war had ended years earlier, but it remained present in damaged buildings, missing relatives, and the way strangers became cautious whenever she mentioned her mother's name. The country had once been divided by religion, class, and political allegiance. Christian militias, Muslim fighters, refugee groups, and foreign-backed factions had all fought for control. Each side had its own dead, its own martyrs, and its own justification for revenge. To understand Nawal's life, Jeanne did not need to learn every political detail. She only needed to understand one fact. In that war, identity could decide whether a person was protected, imprisoned, or killed. The first people Jeanne met did not remember Noelle as the quiet woman who had raised 2 children in Canada. They remembered a young woman who had brought shame to her family. Noelle had grown up in a strict Christian household. As a teenager, she fell in love with a young Muslim refugee named Wahab. Their relationship crossed the boundary her family considered sacred. When Noelle became pregnant, her brothers discovered the truth. They found Wahab and shot him in front of her. The killing was not described as murder inside the family. It was described as the defense of honor. Noelle was supposed to die as well. Her brothers were ready to erase both the pregnancy and the scandal, but her grandmother intervened. The old woman saved Noelle's life, yet the price was terrible. Noelle would be allowed to give birth, but she could not keep the child. Afterward, she would leave the village, continue her education, and never return to the life she had known. When the boy was born, Noelle held him only briefly. She studied his face as though she were trying to memorize a future that had already been taken away. Before the child was sent to an orphanage, her grandmother marked the bottom of his heel with 3 small dots. It was not punishment. It was a sign. One day, if mother and son ever found each other again, Noelle would recognize him. The child was taken to the orphanage at Kfar Hout and given the name Nihad. Noelle was sent to the city of Daresh to study. Outwardly, her old life ended. Inside her, one promise remained untouched. She would come back for her son. Years passed. Noelle became educated, independent, and politically aware. Then the country began to break apart. The roads became dangerous. Neighborhoods were divided by religion. Refugee camps were attacked. Armed checkpoints appeared where ordinary families had once traveled freely. Noelle tried to reach Kfar Hout, but by the time she found the orphanage, it had been destroyed. Some children were said to have died. Others had been taken by armed groups. No one could tell her which fate belonged to Nihad. The loss did not stop her search. It made the search more desperate. She moved through villages and camps, showing people old information, asking about a boy with 3 marks on his heel. The mark that had once seemed like a guarantee now felt almost useless. She was searching for one child among thousands of displaced children in a country where names changed and records disappeared every day. During that journey, Noelle boarded a bus carrying Muslim refugees. The passengers were frightened but quiet. Parents held their children close. Everyone understood that the wrong checkpoint could become a death sentence. The bus was stopped by Christian militiamen. The fighters ordered the passengers out and began shooting them. Noelle survived only because she showed them the cross around her neck and proved that she was Christian. In that moment, religion saved her body while condemning everyone around her. A little girl was still alive. Noelle tried to protect her by claiming the child as her own daughter. For a few seconds, the lie seemed to work. Then the girl heard her mother crying from inside the bus. She tore herself away and ran back toward the burning vehicle. The gunman shot her. Noelle stood alive among the bodies because the killers believed she belonged to them. That moment destroyed whatever remained of her faith in the categories that had governed her childhood. The men who shared her religion had murdered a child in front of her. The people her family had called enemies had died beside her. The war was no longer a distant conflict between opposing groups. It had become a machine that used identity to excuse cruelty. Noelle chose revenge. She made contact with people fighting the Christian nationalist leadership. Because she was educated and spoke French, she was able to enter the home of an influential political leader as a tutor for his son. She appeared calm and harmless. She gained the family's trust. Then she carried a weapon into the house and killed the man. She was arrested almost immediately. Noelle was sent to Kfar Riat, a prison whose name inspired fear even among people hardened by war. She was sentenced to 15 years. Her captors did not want only to confine her. They wanted to erase the person she had been. She was given a number instead of a name, Prisoner 72. She was isolated, beaten, humiliated, and questioned. They demanded information about the people who had helped her. They wanted names, locations, and confessions. Noelle answered with silence. When the pain became unbearable, she sang. Her voice moved through the corridors and reached prisoners who could not see her. The guards tried to stop her, but each time they left, the singing returned. It became proof that Prisoner 72 still possessed something they could not control. The other prisoners began calling her The Woman Who Sings. Years later, Jeanne found a former prison guard who remembered her mother. He had watched Nawal inside Kfar Riat for 13 years. Many prisoners had passed through the cells. Some begged. Some gave information. Some disappeared. He remembered Nawal because she refused to give her captors the reaction they wanted. Her voice had made her famous inside a place designed to keep every prisoner anonymous. For Jeanne, this was almost impossible to connect with the mother she had known. At home in Canada, Nawal had rarely explained herself. Her silences had seemed cold and personal. Now Jeanne was beginning to understand that silence had once been a weapon, and that singing had once been the only part of her identity the prison could not take. But the guards eventually found another way to attack her. They brought in a man known as Abu Tarek. He was not an ordinary interrogator. He was used when the prison wanted to break someone beyond recovery. He entered Nawal's cell repeatedly and raped her. The violence was not described to Jeanne in detail. It did not need to be. Its consequences had lived beside her for her entire life. Nawal became pregnant in prison. She gave birth to twins, a girl and a boy. The children were supposed to disappear. A prison nurse was ordered to remove them, but she secretly kept them alive. She hid them, cared for them, and waited for the day Nawal would be released. The girl was Jeanne. The boy was Simon. For the first time, Jeanne understood why her mother had sent her to find a father she believed was dead. Their biological father had never been the man they had imagined. He was Abu Tarek, the prison torturer. But knowing his name did not solve anything. After the war, Abu Tarek had vanished. Jeanne called Simon. At first, he refused to believe her. Then she told him about Kfar Riat, prisoner 72, the singing, the twins born behind prison walls, and the man who had fathered them through violence. The anger Simon had directed at his mother changed shape. It did not disappear, but it could no longer remain simple. He had spent years judging a woman whose life he had never understood. Simon traveled to join Jeanne, accompanied by the notary who had known Nawal for years. The search was no longer only about fulfilling a strange will. It had become a search for their own origin. They now had two missing men. One was Abu Tarek, their father. The other was Nihad, the first son Nawal had lost before the war. There was no reason to imagine any connection between them. The search for Nihad led through old orphanage records, former fighters, and people who had survived the destruction of Kfar Kaut. Eventually, Simon was taken to meet Shamsuddin, a former leader whose knowledge of the war was greater than any written archive. Shamsuddin knew what had happened to the children from the orphanage. They had not all been killed. Some had been taken and raised by armed groups. Boys who had lost their parents were given uniforms, weapons, and a new idea of family. They learned to obey commanders before they learned how to become adults. Nihad had been one of them. He grew up inside the war. He learned to shoot. He became so skilled that he was used as a sniper. He dreamed of becoming famous, not because he understood fame, but because he wanted proof that he existed. He had no mother, no father, and no true history. A name known by strangers seemed better than a name remembered by no one. The child Nawal had promised to find became a dangerous young man. Later, Nihad was captured by the opposing side. They recognized his talent and his emptiness. Instead of killing him, they transformed him again. The boy from the orphanage had become a fighter. The fighter was turned into an interrogator. The interrogator was placed in a prison. There, he was given another name. Simon listened as Shamsuddin spoke, but the meaning arrived before the final words. The two searches that had seemed separate were beginning to move toward each other. Nihad's new name was Abu Tarek. The first son Nawal had lost was the man who tortured her in Kfar Riat. He had entered her cell without knowing she was his mother. She had faced him without knowing he was the child she had searched for across a ruined country. The three dots were hidden inside a prison where neither of them could see the truth. Abu Tariq was the father of the twins. Nihad was their older brother. They were the same person. Simon later tried to explain it to Jeanne using the only language precise enough to carry the horror. She was a mathematician. She believed numbers remained stable even when human lives did not. Could one person, added to one person, equal one? Could the father they had been searching for and the brother they had been searching for be a single man? Jeanne understood before Simon completed the explanation. Her body reacted first. She could not draw a full breath. She bent forward as though the air had been removed from the room. The truth was not only that their father had raped their mother, it was that their father was also their mother's son. Nihad was their brother because he and the twins had the same mother. He was their father because, as Abu Tariq, he had caused their birth. 1 + 1 had become 1. For Jeanne and Simon, the discovery changed every memory they possessed. Their childhood had not been built on a simple absence. The empty place where a father should have been was connected to the brother they had never known, and both were connected to the violence their mother had carried alone. Jeanne had begun the journey believing that facts would bring order. She had approached the will as a problem that could be solved by records, names, dates, and witnesses. Now the facts had produced an answer that felt impossible, even when every piece of evidence confirmed it. Simon had begun with anger because anger was easier than uncertainty. He had accused Nawal of controlling them from the grave. Only now did he understand that the will was not designed to control their lives. It was designed to prevent a hidden past from controlling them forever. Neither twin could return to the person they had been before the notary opened the envelope. Yet they could finally see their mother as more than the silent woman at home. Her coldness had contained fear. Her distance had contained protection. Her refusal to speak had spared them the truth for years, but it had also trapped all three of them inside a family history with missing names. The worst part of the revelation was not the shock of the relationship alone. It was the recognition that nobody in the prison cell knew the truth. Nihad did not know he was facing his mother. Nawal did not know the man entering her cell was the infant marked with 3 dots. The war had separated them, renamed them, and returned them to each other in the most destructive form possible. And the revelation did not end there. The man at the swimming pool could now be understood. Years after the war, both Nawal and Nihad had been given new lives in Canada. Nawal raised Jeanne and Simon. Nihad lived under the identity created after his past had been buried. They existed in the same country without knowing how close they were. Then at the pool, Nawal saw 3 dots on a man's heel. The mark carried her back to the day her first child was taken from her. She looked at the man and understood that she had finally found the son she had spent her life searching for. Then he turned his face toward her. She recognized Abu Tariq. In one instant, the lost baby and the prison torturer became one person. The son born from her love for Wahab was the man who had raped her. The child she had promised to save had fathered her twins without knowing who she was. That was the moment Nawal lost her voice. Her silence had not begun because she lacked words. It began because every possible word contradicted another. She had found her son, but she had also found her tormentor. She loved the child he had once been and knew the crimes committed by the man he had become. She was his mother and his victim. The shock broke her health. She did not die at the pool, but she never recovered from what she saw there. She withdrew into silence, suffered a severe collapse, and died soon afterward. Now the strange will no longer looked like madness. Nawal had once promised to find her son. She had found him, but she had not spoken to him. She had also hidden the truth from Jeanne and Simon. In her own eyes, she had failed twice. She had not completed the promise made beside Nihad's birth, and she had allowed the silence to continue into the next generation. That was why she asked to be buried face down. It was not because she believed she was responsible for the violence committed against her. It was an act of judgment against her own silence. Until the letters were delivered, she believed she had no right to look toward the world and no right to have her name placed above her body. The will forced her children to walk through the history she had hidden. A simple note saying that their father and brother were the same man would have given them the answer without giving them the truth. They would have known the relationship, but not the path that created it. They needed to know about Wahab. They needed to know about the newborn marked with 3 dots. They needed to know about the orphanage, the bus, the murdered child, and the choice that sent Nawal to prison. They needed to know why she sang. They needed to know how a boy without a family had been trained to kill and then transformed into Abu Tarek. None of this made Nihad innocent. A stolen childhood could explain how he entered the machinery of war, but it could not erase the suffering he caused. Nawal's plan did not ask her children to excuse him. It asked them to see the entire chain. That chain had begun before any of them understood it. A forbidden love led to a murder. A stolen child was raised by fighters. A grieving mother entered a war. Revenge brought her to prison. The lost son became the prison's weapon. The twins were born from an act neither mother nor son understood in its full horror. If the truth remained hidden, the chain would continue through Jeanne and Simon as confusion, anger, and hatred without a name. The 2 letters were the only way Nawal knew to break it. Jeanne and Simon found Nihad in Canada. He was no longer the armed boy described by Shamsuddin or the prison figure remembered by survivors. He appeared to be an ordinary man living inside an ordinary life. But the 2 envelopes carried everything that life had concealed. Both letters were delivered to him. The first addressed him as the father of Jeanne and Simon, the man once known as Abu Tarek. It named the crime that had created the twins and forced him to understand who prisoner 72 had been. The woman in the cell was not a stranger from an enemy faction. She was his own mother. The second letter addressed him as Nihad, Nawal's firstborn son. Its voice was different. It spoke to the child taken from her arms, the boy she had searched for, and the son she had never stopped loving. One letter judged the torturer. The other recognized the son. Nawal did not erase the difference between them, even though they lived in the same body. She refused to pretend that love could cancel guilt. At the same time, she refused to believe that guilt had erased the abandoned child entirely. For Nihad, the letters destroyed every remaining boundary in his identity. The woman he had tortured was his mother. The twins born from that violence were his children. Because they shared the same mother, they were also his brother and sister. He was the missing son, the missing brother, and the missing father. The 2 letters had always been intended for one man, but for 2 different versions of him. There was no reaction large enough for such knowledge. No apology could restore what had been taken. No explanation could change the prison cell. Nihad was left with the truth and with the knowledge that his mother's final act had been both an accusation and a recognition. After the letters were delivered, Jeanne and Simon received the final message Nawal had left for them. The silence had been broken. They now knew the circumstances of their birth. They knew why their mother had seemed unreachable. They knew that her distance had not meant an absence of love. She had carried a history so violent that every attempt to speak risked tearing apart the lives she had built. But Nawal's last message did not ask them to live forever inside her suffering. It asked them not to continue the anger. That did not mean forgetting. It did not mean forgiving everything. It meant refusing to let the war decide what kind of people they would become. A gravestone was finally placed above Nawal. Her body was not moved. She remained as she had requested, facing the earth. What changed was the meaning of the grave. The promise had been completed. The letters had reached the father and the son. The father and the son had turned out to be one person. Her name could finally be carved into stone. Nihad later stood at the grave. He faced the name of a woman who had been his mother and his victim. She had spent years searching for him, then lost her voice when she discovered what the war had made of him. Through the letters, she had given him the truth he had never possessed, but she had not given him an easy escape from it. Nothing at the grave suggested that one act of recognition could redeem a lifetime of violence. The past remained unchanged. Wahab was still dead. The people on the bus were still dead. The little girl still ran toward her mother. The years in prison still existed. Nawal's body still lay with its face toward the earth. But the lie had ended. The war had survived for decades inside hidden names and broken family connections. It had turned a son into his mother's torturer and children into the brother and sister of their own father. Its final battlefield was not a city or a prison. It was the truth carried by one family. Nawal could not undo what had happened. She could only force the truth into the open and trust that her children would not turn it into another weapon. For years she had lived without explaining herself. After death, she made Jeanne and Simon follow every step she could not describe. They found not a clean answer, but a chain of choices, crimes, losses, and accidents in which no single sentence was enough. They learned why their mother wanted to be buried face down. They learned why she had stopped speaking. They learned who their father was. And when the search was over, the woman who had been known as Prisoner 72, the woman who sings, and the silent mother in Canada was no longer buried without an identity. At last, the stone carried her name.